money, power. Accidents don't just happen, and coincidence is only an excuse for the guilty. Welcome to the Conspiracy Chronicles.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
There has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
An incident that took place less than 15 minutes ago at the Washington Hilton Hotel when shots were fired at President Reagan.
A second bomb has been found inside that federal building in Oklahoma City.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly, the second building.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
And now, here are your conspiracy detectives, Joe Joseph and Tim Watts.
Welcome aboard, everybody, to Freedomlink Radio and the Conspiracy Chronicles on this Sunday evening, February the 5th, 2012. And so, tonight, we're going to cover 9/11 in much more detail because it was the catalyst for all that has happened to this country and the world since then. You know, and there are essentially three primary camps of thought that are being argued about regarding the 9/11 issue. We've got the 9/11 plot that totally defeated numerous airport security checks, World Trade Center security and surveillance systems, the FBI and CIA intelligence services, because, you know, they is piping hot, and all active NORAD military defense measures, as well as local built-in Pentagon defense mechanisms. You know, it's meticulously coordinated and executed by Osama bin Laden and his band of al-Qaeda thugs. So this is the DKIWH theory, better known as didn't know it would happen. So that's number one. Then we got number two. Number two is the 9/11 attacks were learned of by some U.S. officials who were warned early on by intel from many countries, but who chose instead to sit on that information, using the opportunity as a new Pearl Harbor in order to engage in preemptive wars of aggression in the Middle East and North Africa by being complicit regarding the attacks, if not odiously helping to facilitate them in order to justify their wars of imperialism. This is the lie hop theory. Let it happen on purpose. And finally, we have the 9/11 event was orchestrated and deliberately engineered solely by rogue government intelligence services, using the alleged hijackers as mere patsies in the plot. The impetus for such a false flag operation includes the spoils from Scenario 2, but with the primary objective being the enactment of a worldwide police state the dissolution of the United States, and the emergence of the long-planned New World Order. And this is the MyHop theory. Made it happen on purpose. Out of the three outlined scenarios, there appears to be two distinctive theories that emerge. One, that the U.S. government was innocently or ignorantly caught by surprise and totally bludgeoned and bungled the defense of the country, and whether it was exploited or heinously engineered, a rogue faction of our government explicitly used the event for its own nefarious agenda. So buckle in and get set for a journey into the events of that fateful day, September 11th, 2001, with my good buddies, Tim Watts, John King, and Popeye from federaljack.com. Guys, I think it's important to have a roundtable discussion on this because out of all those three scenarios, I personally am of the MyHop. I have a MyHop hat on. Made it happen on purpose. Why? Well, the events of today actually tell us or give us some insight that, yeah, you know what? This is actually happening. That this event ushered in the entire justification for the police state. And if anybody doesn't know about the Federation of American Scientists, that website, FAS.org, is a treasure trove of information. You just can't possibly get a better website when it comes to finding out strengths and weaknesses of a foreign military or even domestic military, different capabilities of governments, get a government breakdown like an intel report. There's so much information to be gleaned from FAS.org. But specifically, I'm talking about a blog entry that was put in yesterday. Congress calls for accelerated use of drones in the U.S. This is very important, folks. A House Senate conference report this week called on the administration to accelerate the use of civilian unmanned aerial systems, UAS, or drones in U.S. airspace. The pending authorization bill for the FAA directs the Secretary of Transportation to develop within 9 months a comprehensive plan to safely accelerate the integration of civil unmanned aircraft systems into the national airspace system. What does that mean? Let me tell you what that means. What that means is Big Brother are going to be watching you from the skies if they ain't already. That master is going to be watching you at all times. I'm telling you right now that that's what's happening. And let me tell you something. When privacy's gone in a society, you're talking about horrific consequences to that. Absolutely horrific. As if it's not bad enough now, folks. As if you can't see what the hell is going on. If they start this crap where you have drones all over the place and the FAA has to make corrections to its policies to accommodate these things hovering over cities and in flight paths to give them right of way. I mean, this is huge. This is enormous. Why are they doing this? And furthermore, why are more of you not speaking out against this? Tim and I and John and Popeye, we work real hard to make sure that the people listening to this broadcast get the information needed so that you can take it and spread the word on your own time. And it's so imperative that you pick that up and you run with it. It's kind of like a relay race, okay? And our opponent is the powers that be, the New World Order. Whatever you want to call them, whatever conspiracy name you want to put to it, that's who they are. And we're running a relay race against them. And so we pass the wand to you and hope that you run with it and pass it to somebody else. Because I guarantee you that these asshats are passing him to their next crony. And they always seem to stay one step ahead. But there's an awakening going on in this country And I know this because when I approach people now, they start to accept this. Before, concrete barrier, couldn't penetrate it. Now there's cracks. So step up, pass this information along. When we come back, we're going to talk about 9/11, go over the theories, the 3 theories of 9/11, and so much more, because it's so important to understand, because we're living with the consequences of that fateful day. You're listening to Conspiracy Chronicles on Orion Talk Radio. We'll be right back. If you would notice the chip-in banner up at the top of the page or on the home page to Orion Talk Radio, chip in your 42 cents, your dollar, whatever it is that you can chip in to Orion Talk Radio so that we can make improvements, expand the operation, and reach more people. That's the purpose of it. The hosts here don't get paid a dime. Everything gets put into the kitty for expansion of services. So please donate today. We're talking about 9/11. And Tim, you were talking before the show about special interests or people that have benefited from 9/11. Can you get into that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. And it's like you said in the opening, Joe, this, folks, you have to realize that 9/11 was the catalyst for everything that's happened in our world right now up to this date. Everything has come about because of 9/11. And you have to entertain 2 things. It was either all just a coincidence, all just a wild-ass coincidence, or it's a conspiracy. And it's a conspiracy for people that are going to benefit, against all of us. And when you follow a conspiracy, you follow the money. You want to look at who profited and who benefited, from the event. And were there beneficiaries? Absolutely. And as much as it pains me to say so, the United States is the sole beneficiary, of 9/11. Well, that along with Israel. Because, they gained a new strategic Middle East foothold. They got oil and gas, and we've got new governments all throughout the Middle East. And the military-industrial complex, they've also benefited. I mean, look at the trillions in war expenditures that have gone out the door all of a sudden as a result of 9/11. And hundreds of billions in war profits for these profiteers. You've got the Department of Defense. Their budgets greatly increased after 9/11. The U.S. intelligence services, their budgets greatly increased. And then you've got, if you're not aware of PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, they've changed their name now, gutless bastards that they are, but at any rate, their policies for a U.S. world dominance has all come to fruition. So there are people that have benefited, and again, Israel benefited. And then you've got individuals who benefited, like the Bush family. They're into oil investments. The Carlyle Group, with their war profits. You've got Dick Cheney, Halliburton war profits. Don't think these people didn't profit, folks, because they've gained billions of dollars, and it all came as a result of 9/11. And then you take a look at who were the biggest losers. I mean, undoubtedly it's us, because of all the things that have been acted against us. But, I mean, take a look at the Afghanistan people. How many of their citizens were murdered? Their country was ravaged. The Iraqi people, all of their citizens that were murdered, women raped, children killed, their country ravaged as well. Then you've got the Libyan people, the best standard of living in North Africa and possibly the Middle East, save for Kuwait. That's all down the tubes. This has all been because of 9/11. And you can't argue against that. I mean, because if we didn't have 9/11, none of this could have happened. Essentially, we've had 3 unprovoked wars because of 9/11. I mean, never before have we ever at least admitted to, unprovoked warfare. We always kind of found a way to, create a false flag. But now we just march in there, with the flag in one hand and a cross or a Bible in the other hand, as we claim that, we're going in to kill the evildoers, as it were, I mean, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, right. 3 countries that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. And in all those places, we conveniently now have new governments, folks. Think about that. Is that a coincidence? They're changing the face of the Middle East, and this has clearly had to be, something that was thought about going into 9/11. I mean, when you look at the PNAC again, they had their what was it, the Reforming for America, where they wanted to make sure that nobody could challenge Americans' dominance in the world.
Rebuilding America's defenses.
There you go. Yep, building America's defenses. And all of this.
What did Wesley Clark say? He backs your whole point up. Remember, he came out and said that right after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon and he saw a general he knew, and the guy showed him plans for like 7 countries, I believe it was.
Yep. And all 7 of those, I mean, we're attacking every one of them, folks. Now, think about that. As Popeye said, 7 countries were all named. I mean, you had, Iraq, and Iran's on the list, and Libya, and Syria, Somalia, Sudan. I mean, every single one of these is happening. Is it a coincidence? It's not. It's absolutely not a coincidence. This is an orchestrated conspiracy. And this was back in 2001 that Wesley Clark was told that we were going to attack 7 nations. Now, we're 10 years past 9/11. Did we just suddenly find a reason to attack these countries? I don't think so. Again, it was all laid out, on 9/11. Or shortly after 9/11, and many people would say it was all laid out before 9/11. But
things like the Patriot Act, Tim, those were going through Congress years before it actually got passed. They needed the event to solidify the people behind it.
Yeah, you look at the Patriot Act. There's no way that voluminous piece of legislative BS was written in 7 weeks' time. And it wasn't just Viet Dinh either that did that. There are other people that were behind that, but they'd like everybody to believe, oh, yeah, we came up with this, because of 9/11. That's impossible. Look at the legalese that was involved in drafting that. That thing was worked on for a long, long, long time.
I've seen evidence to point that it dates back to like 99, around that time. Like the foundations of it. So it was like 2 years in the making.
Yeah, I've seen that too, Popeye, and I believe that, because it would take that long to, put something like that together. It's a huge snare to entrap the Constitution is essentially what it is. But for all intents and purposes, I mean, think about it, folks. 9/11 was a very short-lived attack. I mean, how long did it take? But ever since then, our constitutional rights have been under attack. They've been assaulted every single day now. And as Joe said, now we're talking about putting drones in the air. What the hell is putting drones in the air going to do to save your freedoms? Seriously? I mean, it's all about protecting somebody else. It's all about protecting corporatism and the powers that be in this country. There's no way putting drones in the American skies is going to stop terrorism. And think about it this way. If we had a gazillion drones in the air, on 9/11, would that really have stopped 9/11? Absolutely not. I mean,
no, it wouldn't have stopped 9/11. Absolutely not. The plan would have still have gone on just the way it was supposed to, and things would have went just the way it was supposed to, and we would be where we are today, regardless of if NORAD had taken things seriously, if they had scrambled fighter jets, if there wasn't a training exercise that day, all these different things. It's funny because they always say, they're doing this to protect our freedom. They're doing it to defend our freedom, baby. Yep. Let me ask you something, folks. Do you feel more free? Do you feel freer now that all of this police state BS has been implemented? Let me further ask you, are you safer today than you were 10, 15 years ago? Let me further ask you this. Were our parents safer 30 or 40 years ago than we are today? Because I guarantee you, man, I'm going to give you an example. Before there was a seatbelt law, the cars used to not have seatbelts in it. And you want to know something? My folks made it. They all made it here. And guess what? They weren't safe. They weren't as safe as they were. But now they're safe because, we have all these seat belts to save our lives. And the government knows and they understand what's in our best interest. It's so important to understand, but they have our best interests at heart. It's BS, folks. Total bunk. When we come back from break, I want John King to weigh in on this. He's going to get a little King's Court. So don't go away. You're listening to the Conspiracy Chronicles on the Orion Talk Radio Network. We'll be right back.
I'm afraid my baby's gonna do me
Welcome back, folks. Don't forget, coming up immediately after the Conspiracy Chronicles here, Ken and the Information Nation hits the airwaves. So stay on and listen to Uncle Ken. And so we were talking about the police state that really ushered in and the beneficiaries to 9/11 and who benefited from them financially from a power standpoint. But before we get back into that, I want to segue to John King for his King's Court. John, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Joe. What makes me shake my head these days is that most people think that the police are there to protect their rights, when that is very far from the truth. You are the only one that can protect your rights, and only you can properly assert them. When Benjamin Franklin emerged from Independence Hall in Philadelphia at the conclusion of the Continental Constitutional Convention in 1787, he was approached by Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia. It was then there that she asked the now famous question, "Well, doctor, what have we, a republic or a monarchy?" And it is said that Dr. Franklin, without hesitation, said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." They knew that the state would become corrupt and try to take away our basic rights and liberties, as we, as the people, would have to forever be vigilant to keep them. The police are not there to protect your rights, only read them to you. They work for the state. The only way for them to be successful is to take as many rights and liberties from you as they can. The state wants more power, not less. Any, and I mean any, candidate that promises smaller government is a liar, and that would take away from his or her autonomous power enacted by his predecessors. Now, we all know that the state is run as a corporation with corporate rules. What's the first and foremost goal of any corporation? Profit. And they turn a good one, and do so with the efficiency of a Ferengi from Star Trek. They have about the same moral character, too. The people who are appointed to high office are usually criminals with something to hide or face jail time if exposed, or have the same agenda as the powers that be. Most are highly egotistical and almost have a god complex as to be referred to as our national messiah. They are going to get what they want. It is too late. You're not going to stop them. Most of you think that some police or military will not respond in the same way as they do in Europe. They have proven their willingness to do so. Just go to YouTube and search for Pittsburgh G20. These are all undisputed facts. I believe that the powers that be will not attack Iran until after 2012 election. The positions of the major party candidates, but one, are the same when it comes to Iran. Iran will get tired of getting poked in the eye without poking back. They already have the support of our creditor, China, and our ally, however shaky that relationship is, Russia. And India just decided to buy oil from Iran with rupees instead of dollars, thrusting a knife into the already fragile economy, thus in return raising inflation as more money that was unaccounted for is flooded back into the system. The Fed said it will not adjust interest rates till 2014, but seeing is believing, and the word of liars is about as sticky as spit. That is also very interesting, as their goal to start the new government into action before 2012 is over and have full collapse by 2018 and an integrated world economy by 2023. But don't take my word for it. I was wrong once. Joe and Tim, back to you.
Thank you, my man. And so here we are. We're talking about the beneficiaries to 9/11. And Tim, you brought up a good point, like Mr. Cheney and Halliburton. He didn't just benefit from 9/11. There was many other things. But 9/11 was that was the first thing that I actually saw the whole Halliburton thing come into play. And then from there, it was kind of easy to see the other events that Halliburton benefited from because of the fact that Mr. Cheney was in a place of power. It's very interesting to see these relationships.
Yeah, they always find a way to pad their own pockets, folks, you got to realize that, these people, they pulled off the coup of all times, and they're making money at it too, and they're laughing at you, they're laughing at us, they're laughing at everybody. This whole 9/11 event, again, is the catalyst that has changed our world, and they admit that. They say it over and over. Oh, the world will never be the same again. Why? For crying out loud. I mean, we had one stinking event. And, here's the thing about that event. Our officials failed us miserably on that day. They did not fulfill their duties. I mean, do you get that? I mean, most of you understand that right now. Our officials failed us miserably, and yet we're the ones that are asked to bear the brunt of that.
That's right. Not only did they fail miserably, but, it was downright criminal what they did. So, and if this was intentionally done by a faction within the government and or people turned the other cheek and was an accessory to the crime, well, then there needs to be some serious justice doled out here, too. I mean, this has affected our whole way of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you mentioned earlier, about, they said terrorists hate us for our freedoms. That was Bush's big line. The terrorists hate us for our freedoms. So what did our politicians do? Hey, they took our freedoms away from us. Oh, I guess that takes care of any jealousy problem. Terrorists did not steal our freedoms, folks. Our chicken shit politicians did that. They traded our Constitution for their bogus war on terror, with the air quotes up now. I mean, there's no other way you can argue that. And terrorism is nothing more than scaring a society. It's about creating fear and a way to change the way that society runs. Have they done that? Absolutely. They've changed everything about our life. They've enacted anti-constitutional laws. They've got TSA searches. They're talking about putting drones in the air in America. And I guarantee you it's not going to be too long before you won't be able to travel from California to Oregon or Florida to Georgia or Minnesota to Wisconsin without having to stop for a border check. I mean, when are you guys going to say enough is enough? Because these things aren't protecting our freedoms. If you don't see they're taking our freedoms away, our freedom to do everything in our life, it's all being changed. It's all been changed because of 9/11. But the thing about 9/11 that you need to realize, if you don't already, or that you need to get through to your friends, your coworkers, your family members, is that 9/11 was such an absurdity on so many levels. Again, how many coincidences is too much? When you have a few coincidences, that's one thing. But, again, 9/11, I can probably name, guys, 60 things that they've tried to say are coincidence. Number one, it's physically impossible for buildings to fall that fast. That was the first thing that I noticed that morning, when I watched that. You saw those buildings come down in 10 seconds or less. And for me, I went for my stopwatch, and I did the time. And for those buildings to drop that fast, well, let's just take World Trade Center Building 1. That building drops in 9 seconds. That's 12 floors a second. 12 floors a second. Now, I've done this before, but I want you to try this little exercise with me. I just want you to say to yourself, 1/1000. Seriously, because that's the time it took for 12 floors to fall per second. 1/1000. Now, think about standing outside of your house, your own house, whether it's a one-story or it's a two-story house, collapsing just that way in 1 second's time in front of you. Now, do you really think that's possible? To see your house go from the chimney to the rooftop to the basement in 1 second? 1/1000. Because, again, that's what happened on 9/11. You saw 12 floors per second in World Trade Center 1. The entire building, 110 floors in nothing more than 9 seconds. That's absolutely phenomenal. So that's, the first thing that to me, that stood out about 9/11. I remember my wife and I both looking at each other and said, that's a controlled demolition. Folks, we've all seen buildings fall before. I mean, the laws of physics were absolutely broken on 9/11. I mean, think about cause and effect. Any of you that have taken physics, had some sort of physics background, cause and effects has to come into play. That 110th floor has to come down on the 109th floor, and then it has to strain, it has to groan, and then it has to give way before it hits the 108th floor. Cause and effect was literally thrown out the window that day. That building should have taken 50 to 90 seconds to fall apart at the very least, and yet it came down in 9 seconds.
9 seconds. I mean, that's crazy. Folks, don't go away. Tim is going to wow you with more of his knowledge when we come back from break. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Stream Live. So go ahead to TalkStreamLive.com. Check out Freedomlink Radio and thumb it up. Get us up in the rankings, you know what I'm saying? Tonight, Tim Watts, John King, and myself, we're talking 9/11. And Tim was talking about free fall speed and the fact that these buildings are falling so doggone fast that it's almost, well, he noticed it at the time. I mean, I was just a schmuckatoid then and didn't understand what I was looking at. And, you know, people like that, Tim, that can spot this stuff out, they're few and far between these days. You know, I don't know if it's just been a dumbing down or whatever, or just, you know, lack of life experience. But I didn't actually awaken to these kind of facts till like 2007, 2008 or so. And that's when things started to smell fishy. And but you make a great point, because one of the hinge pins to it was, how does a building fall through the path of most resistance at free fall speed?
Absolutely. And that's the key. You know, Joe just hit on it. It's got to come through the path of most resistance. There's got to be a structure underneath it that has to go. And the thing that's different about the World Trade Center destruction, at least for Towers 1 and 2, from a normal demolition, controlled demolition, is that in a normal controlled demolition, they start from the bottom up, you know, and everything kind of comes down. But they didn't do that with 9/11. They left the structure intact below that, and they took it from the top down, at least for Towers 1 and 2. So how does the top structure fall through the lower structure like that at free fall speed? And I mean it. You honestly have to sit there and ask yourself that. You have to think about it. I mean, because anybody that's had a basic background in physics or taken any, you know, physics in science class in high school, just basic elementary physics, is going to tell you that cause and effect was absolutely thrown out the window that day. And again, I can't highlight it enough. The 110th floor has to come down on the 109th. And here's the first thing to think about. Engineers aren't stupid. When they put these buildings up, especially these big, massive buildings, they don't want them to come down. So they overrate, you know, the strength of these buildings. They know that one floor, God forbid, could come down on another one because of who knows what. And they don't want these buildings to just come down in a pancake collapse, as, you know, NIST tried to tell us and the government tried to tell us. That's absolutely ridiculous. And I know for a fact, because there's 1,500 architects and engineers that have already signed on board and said absolutely that. It's just BS. There's no way that can happen, because these engineers and these architects, they overrate each floor. They know that if there's an accident, they want it to be able to hold. But what happened on 9/11, all these floors kept coming down on top of each other. And if you figured maybe also just say a half a second for each floor to fall on top of each other. So, you know, a half a second from the 110th to the 109th to fall, and then maybe to get that one to give way, and then another half a second for the 108th. You add that up, that's damn near a minute at a half a second. So think about that. There wasn't even a half a second between floors collapsing. I mean, you had 12 floors in 1 second. That's absolutely absurd on every level, and you have to realize that. I mean, you have to wrap your mind around that one little fact that the media has hidden from you. 12 floors in 1 second, 1/1000. That's just absolutely impossible. But then you know, we had World Trade Center Building 7, which is kind of the smoking gun. Not for me, but I know for a lot of people, because, see, that building was never hit by an airplane. And that building, you know, it had some small fires in there. I mean, nothing really big. You know, they were just small, isolated fires. And yet when that building fell at 5:20 in the afternoon, it fell in 6.5 seconds. And it fell just like Towers 1 and 2, perfectly symmetrical. at near free fall speed right into their own footprints, exactly the way you'd want a controlled demolition to be. You don't want it to destroy, all the buildings around it. You want it to come straight down. So what are the odds that we had three high-rise buildings fall into their own footprints in the same day, when we've never, ever had one building fall ever in the history of modern engineering and architecture? Not one. Not one single building has ever toppled because of fire. Yet we had three of them fall in one day. And you can't just say it was because of airplanes, because, the engineers that built those buildings, they also built them to withstand multiple airplane strikes. Not just one airplane, but multiple airplane strikes. They were specifically engineered to do that.
For a fully loaded 707 going 600 miles an hour.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It's not like a freaking Cessna. You're talking about a fully loaded jumbo jet flying into that thing full of fuel at 600 miles an hour. And that thing was made to withstand multiple hits.
Yeah.
And not to mention the fact that you're talking about a whole hollow aluminum projectile. It's not like we're talking about a penetrator round from a freaking howitzer or something, This was a freaking hollow aluminum tube. It's like shooting a freaking drinking straw through it.
Yeah, like trying to push a pop can through a brick wall.
Yeah, but, exactly right.
Here's another thing to think about for those of you that don't know your history. The Empire State Building was actually hit by a B-25 bomber in 1945. A B-25 bomber slams into that. But you know what? It was, strangely enough, almost at, the same level. I'm trying to think, is 101 stories or something like that for the Empire State Building.
Right, and something like that.
Yeah. So you got this 10-ton aircraft that slammed into the Empire State Building, and that didn't fall. That didn't go into a free fall collapse. Now, and that's an older engineered building. That isn't built to the same design standards that the World Trade Center was built to. So, why didn't that building topple? Again, the implausibility.
Good question.
And then, the other thing that they tried to say, well, the jet fuel is what did it. But, jet fuel, folks, is essentially like kerosene, and kerosene and jet fuel are just, they don't burn hot enough to melt nor soften steel girders. The temperature of jet fuel is roughly 1,120 degrees Celsius, which is 2,048 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's almost 700-800 degrees under what it takes for the melting point of steel, because the melting point of steel is 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so that's you've got an 800-degree difference from the maximum temperature of a jet fuel fire. But our government, remember this, Joe and John? They actually tried to argue after the fact that, oh no, buildings and steel don't actually melt at 2,800 degrees. They melt at 2,500 degrees because they wanted some plausibility to their story. Unfortunately, the scientific community wasn't having any of that. Every one of those guys, they argued against that, and rightfully so. So,
John, John works at John, you work in the metal or steel industry. What do you know about that?
We pour our iron at an average of
2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. But now I wonder, is that iron or is that steel? That's going to be the big question. And John just lost his connection, so we'll get him back in a moment. But even so, here's the argument, Tim, that a lot of people give is, well, did it go just hot enough to where it weakened the steel? Not melt it, but just weaken it enough to sag it, Well,
there's a lot to go against that, too, because, number one, those fires didn't burn more than 15 to 20 minutes. And you can tell that by the smoke, the way it poured out of those buildings. It was an oxygen-deprived fire. It was going out. So these things only burn 15 to 20 minutes. You can go back and look at the footage, and you'll see the same thing. And we've had other buildings that burned far longer than that. You guys remember the Windsor Tower in Madrid,
sure.
Spain, when it burned in 2005?
That thing glowed like a freaking, like a shooting star almost. I mean, that was a blaze, man.
It was phenomenal, yeah. From top to bottom, you had flames shooting out 100 feet on all sides of the building, and not just, in a couple of floors. It was all the way up. It was just phenomenal. And if you folks don't believe that, go take a look and look up the Madrid-Windsor fire. It happened on February 12th in 2005, and that fire burned for 21 straight hours. 21 straight hours, nearly a full day of just nonstop burning, and it never fell. It was a raging inferno from top to bottom. And strangely enough, that was the work of arson. And a lot of people think that, someone was trying to make a point about the World Trade Center because they actually used accelerants in that building to drive that fire to extreme temperatures. And yet again, it never fell. Now, it never fell. And here's the thing about the Windsor fire. They originally reported that to be 1,500 degrees Celsius, which is 2,732 degrees Fahrenheit. 2,732 degrees Fahrenheit, just under the melting point of steel.
And it still stood.
Yeah, it still stood. Now, what's interesting about that is the next day, they revised that. And what was reported in the news, like, oh, did we say 1,500 degrees Celsius? Oh no, we meant 800 degrees Celsius. Because they knew right away there was a problem. They knew that people were going to connect the dots and go, hey, wait a minute. If this building was that hot, so, you see, they tried to hide that, too.
Of course, they always pull these kind of shenanigans. Folks, hour number 1 is at a close. Hour number 2 coming up after these messages, so stay tuned. More 9/11 on the way. You're listening to Freedomlink Radio, Conspiracy Chronicles on the Orion Talk Radio Network.
When you go to OrionTalkRadio.com, check out our Zazzle.com store, where sales help support our network. This is Max. Thanks again for listening.
In a world of big money power, accidents don't just happen, and coincidence is only an excuse for the guilty. Welcome to the Conspiracy Chronicles.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
There has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy. He was wounded in an automobile driving from Dallas Airport into downtown Dallas. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
An incident that took place less than 15 minutes ago at the Washington Hilton Hotel when shots were fired at President Reagan.
A second bomb has been found inside that federal building in Oklahoma City.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly, the second building.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
And now, here are your conspiracy detectives, Joe Joseph and Tim Watts.
Welcome back to hour number 2 of Conspiracy Chronicles. I'm Joe Joseph. Tim Watts here. And before the break, we were talking about fire and just how, in the course of history, fire has not fallen a skyscraper to date. And, Tim, you wanted to talk about the one in China, correct?
Yeah, there's another one that's just like the Windsor Tower. And again, you know, folks, you've got to look at these photos. Look up the Chinese BTCC building. It was the Beijing Television Cultural Center. And again, like the Windsor Tower in Madrid, Spain, this thing burned like a Roman candle from top to bottom. And when you look at it, you're going to like, my gosh, what a fire. I mean, it is from top to bottom. It is an inferno that just envelops and engulfs the entire building. Now, this one happened on February 9th in 2009. And again, a top-to-bottom burning. This building burned for, I think, 6 hours. And again, there was no collapse whatsoever. Now, the World Trade Center, we got to back up a second, and you look and you remember, I mean, we saw the initial explosion, a little fireball on the outside of the building, which again showed that most of the jet fuel was outside the building. It didn't go inside. That burned off on the outside. So what was it that possibly could have compromised these buildings? Because it certainly wasn't fire, because the World Trade Center towers burned no more than 15 to 20 minutes. And again, any firefighter, and if we had Popeye back there, he'd tell you the same thing. The smoke that poured from those buildings proved that that was an oxygen-starved building. So
yes.
You've got the Madrid Trade Center towers, you've got the Chinese BTCC building. All of these buildings burned just massively, like infernos, top to bottom, you know, flames shooting out 60 to 100 feet on all sides on every floor. And I'm not exaggerating, folks. Look at the photos. Every single floor, your jaw will hang open, and you think, all right, if these buildings burned like this, why didn't they collapse? Because our government and NIST are telling us, oh, no, yeah, this is the way buildings fall. But, you know, and it's not just these, Joe, because we've had a lot of high-rise buildings that have burned over the years. You've had the first Interstate Bank building in Los Angeles in 1988. That was 62 floors. It burned for nearly 4 hours with no collapse. You had the One New York Plaza building in New York in 1970. That's a 50-story building. 5 floors on that building burned for 6.5 hours. Again, no collapse. One Meridian Plaza in Philadelphia in 1991. That one burned for 18 hours. Again, there's another, you know, almost a full day of burn and no collapse. The Caracas Tower in Venezuela, 56-story building. That one burned almost a full day, 17 hours. 17 hours and no collapse. And then, of course, we mentioned the Madrid Tower and the Chinese building. So none of these buildings have ever collapsed, folks, and they burned far hotter and far longer than the World Trade Center. And that has to call into question the official story that we've been fed, the absolute BS, that these buildings could have come down that fast with small isolated fires that burned, you know, at best 15 to 20 minutes.
No, absolutely. Absolutely, Tim.
Every one of us saw that day what happened, you know. So.
Yeah, and you know, it's often argued that the real conspiracy theory is the government's official version. You know, the government wants you to believe that 19 men divided into 4 groups, not armed with guns or explosives, but with mere simple box cutters, were able to bypass security at 3 major airports, overwhelm the crew and passengers of 4 airplanes despite being greatly outnumbered, then fly the planes with little or no piloting skills, easily defeating well-structured, long-standing U.S. air defense systems, skillfully steering 3 of the mammoth jetliners unabated into their designated targets, crumbling the Twin Towers in a near free-fall fashion into their own footprints in 10 seconds or less, while also striking the Pentagon, the most secure structure with the most guarded airspace in the entire world, which was somehow left undefended even after declaring that America was already under attack for over a half an hour before it was hit by a plane that had its transponder off for 41 minutes. You know, there was no intercept of that obvious hijack, nor either of the New York flights, which had transponders off for 26 and 17 minutes respectively. The military allegedly tried to muster an air defense, but just couldn't get there in time? Are you serious? I mean, what kind? And we're expected to believe this? I mean, who's the crackpot crazy people here?
And that's a lot to swallow. That's a good point, Joe. I mean, that if folks take all of that in, that's what they expect you to buy. That's it in a nutshell, and that is a lot. Literally, I mean, Joe could read that twice, and my mouth would still hang open. I would go, "Wow, that's an awful lot to expect." But on the flip side of that, those of us that have been searching, for a more reasoned response, we would suggest the following: that a rogue group of high-ranking government officials with complete control and unfettered access to federal aviation systems and U.S. military operations either exploited an uncovered terrorist plot or they engineered a false flag operation of their own to attack symbolic targets in the country, all of which held beneficial side gain to U.S. officials from either their substantial wealth resources or else crucial incriminating records that needed to be destroyed, all conveniently contained within these targets, all the while initiating an environment of fear and panic that could be used to consolidate government power through the restriction of rights, while enabling an excuse for unprovoked wars that immediately benefit the military-industrial complex, the corporate elite, the PNAC, as we mentioned, and the latter, which penned a document in September of 2000 entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, which openly talked of a new Pearl Harbor in order to facilitate its agenda. So both plots may be hard to conceive, but really, when you get down to it, the fact of the matter is the last scenario that I just outlined is arguably a lot easier to achieve, and that's due to the overwhelming number of PNAC members that were strategically positioned in key government seats of power. Folks, you had 10 of these members, 10 of the PNAC members that were in the Bush administration, all of them in high-level positions within the administration. And now they've changed their name because they know people are onto them. And they don't, just like, Blackwater changed their name to XE, and now they've changed their name to Academy. Now it's the Project for the New American Century. They've done the same thing. Now they call themselves the FPI, the Foreign Policy Initiative. So,
and not to mention, Tim, Cheney's wife was in the bunker with him. Why was she there? All these things people need. You got to think and say, wow, something is really screwed up here. We'll be right back after these messages, folks. It's getting hot in here, just like it did that day on 9/11. So sit tight. We'll be right back. Back, folks. We're talking 9/11. And Tim, you brought up the Project for a New American Century. There's a lot of high-profile people associated with that project, isn't there?
Absolutely. And, folks, this is what once you recognize, this is the group that said they wanted to make America the top country in the world. They said, that nobody else could challenge us, and that this was our moment in history to make America number one, and to ensure that no other country could challenge our dominance. So they wrote this paper, and they wrote it 1 month to the day, when before, or actually 1 year to the month from when 9/11 actually happened. So in September 2000, they put out this document, and going so far as to even say that we need a new Pearl Harbor in order to get through all these radical reforms that we want to do in America. And that's a key thing to think about. They were thinking about a new Pearl Harbor. And less than 1 year later, or exactly 1 year later, we've got a new Pearl Harbor. Again, coincidence, or is this a conspiracy? And when you realize how many of these people from the PNAC, from the PNAC, the people that drafted this document, that were actually in the Bush administration, now it becomes doable. Because Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, he was in the PNAC. So was Donald Rumsfeld. He was the Secretary of Defense. You had Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Peter Rodman, the Assistant Secretary of Defense. Elliott Abrams, the National Security Council. You had Richard Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State. Robert B. Zolnick, the Deputy Secretary of State. You had Elliot Cohen, counselor to the U.S. State Department. You had Scooter Libby. He was Chief of Staff for Cheney. You had John Bolton, the UN ambassador. I mean, there was a lot of people that were in the administration that were part of this group that wanted a new American century. So when you realize that they were in not just in the administration, but high positions of power where they could actually control and facilitate a coup like this, then the absurd doesn't start to seem so absurd. You know, the absurd is essentially what they tried to tell us on 9/11. And once you realize this, it's quite easy to understand how a focused collective of individuals in high seats of power could possibly collaborate to facilitate a common agenda against us. So, you know, there's a lot of people that don't want to believe this, Joe. You know, and I know that's tough for them because it's like it's too paradigm unsettling for them. It's like, oh, my gosh, you know, this is just too much. I just don't want my head's going to explode. La, 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 la. I don't want to hear it, you know. But you've got to understand, folks, that it was all possible because of, you know, who was in what position of power at the time.
Yeah.
So
no, you're absolutely right.
And the other thing about it is you look at what our officials did on 9/11, Joe. And again, I mentioned, you know, because they all failed miserably in their jobs. And that's the truth. Every one of them, they failed miserably. They're the ones that should have gone to jail. Every one of them, they failed. You look at all the safety measures in our national defense that all fell apart because we scheduled multiple war games, coincidentally, conveniently, on 9/11. And what were they supposed to be doing, Joe? They were supposed to be protecting against a terrorist attack. And you had, you know, some say we had 4 major war games going on the day, and now some say, oh, no, it was far more than that. Think about that. What are the odds that they schedule this many events that are anti-terrorist related on the day that the biggest terrorist attack happens in America? It's absurd.
Yeah, I was going to say, with those odds, man, you might have wanted to play the lottery that day, you know, because it's just so damn near impossible to get something like that. And you were talking about people being in power, the people in power at the time. You know, here's George W. Bush. He sat in a Florida classroom, and he's derelict. The guy's derelict. There's so many people who were derelict in their duties on 9/11. Because of inaction or because of something that they didn't do that they were supposed to do. It's just amazing. So George Bush, he's sitting in this classroom. He's derelict of duty as a commander-in-chief. I mean, here he is. He is the boss, the grand master of all the military. While we're under attack, he said he already knew that a plane had hit the World Trade Center before he went into the Florida classroom. Yet, he said and did nothing. You know, Chief of Staff Andrew Card told him in no uncertain words, quote, "The second tower has been hit. America is under attack." Yet he decided to stay seated in the classroom and kept reading My Pet Goat. Why didn't the Secret Service remove Bush from the classroom, as they were supposed to do, considering the fact that this country was under attack? Right? There's protocol here, folks. He gave no orders whatsoever to Chief of Staff Andrew Card. Bush said and did absolutely nothing. Supreme Court appointed President George W. Bush was negligent in his duties on 9/11. The leader of the free world had just been told that for the first time since our nation's independence, the mainland of the United States of America was under attack, yet he just sat there. You know, he did a short photo op with the same teacher before and afterwards. So he was clearly in no hurry whatsoever to see if we were being attacked anywhere else, like maybe Chicago or Los Angeles, or perhaps even Washington, D.C. So what's up with that, Tim?
That you know, and the last point that you mentioned, Joe, to me is the most glaring. I mean, when you watch the video of him coming into Booker Elementary School, he does this short photo op with the teacher there, and then they go about the class, and then Andrew Card comes in and tells him the country's under attack. But then after he knows all this, he gets up, and rather than hurry out of the room, which he should have done immediately when Andrew Card told him that, I mean, once the whole thing is over, he gets up and he does another photo op with the same teacher that he already did a photo op with. I mean, you got to ask folks, why the hell? Here's the commander-in-chief of the United States, and he's standing posing for pictures with someone he already posed for pictures with to begin with. I mean, what part of the United States is under attack doesn't he get? So these are questions you have to get past. You have to ask yourself. But, you know, another guy that was derelict, Joe, in his duty was Donald Rumsfeld. Because Rumsfeld, first off, you know, when the New York buildings were hit, the World Trade Center towers, he told Christopher Cox, he says, this thing isn't over. I guarantee you it's not over. Matter of fact, we're probably going to be hit, meaning the Pentagon. And what happens? The Pentagon's hit. But what does Rumsfeld do? Rather than, you know, act in his capacity as the Secretary of Defense, he runs out onto the Pentagon lawn to supposedly help out with stretchers and stuff like that. Now, what the hell does his presence on the lawn do for the rescue effort? Absolutely nothing. Nothing.
And furthermore, what is his decrepit ass going to do handling stretchers? I mean, people don't remember, but he was in his mid-70s, late 70s at the time that this happened, or I should say early to mid-70s. So, yeah. I mean, it's not like the guy's going to be lifting stretchers and running bodies back and forth, you know? Yeah. So what the hell was he going to do out on the damn lawn?
And that's not his job. Again, folks, that's really key to understand. That was not his job. His job is to execute an orchestrated defense of the country. And now, again, think back to his comments to Christopher Cox. He says, oh, yeah, I think we'll probably be hit. Well, they were hit. And so what's his first thought? Rather than go about executing or orchestrating a defense of the country, he hightails it out of his office and heads out onto the lawn. Now, the fact that he was out there added nothing, absolutely nothing, to the rescue effort. However, his detraction from the chain of command at that time was an egregious breach of military protocol, which directly impeded the proper defense of the country during this attack. So that is key to understand. He was derelict in his duty.
Most certainly. When we get back, I want to talk about a couple of people, a couple more people, Dick Cheney and Rudy Giuliani, who were also complicit in this. So when we come back, we'll talk about them too. Sit tight, folks. Last half an hour on the way. You're listening to Freedomlink Radio. You know, folks, when you lay out 9/11 the way that we're doing right now, it makes it really, 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 really hard to buy the official story. As a matter of fact, you can't. I mean, unless you're just an ass clown, which I just can't possibly imagine anybody believing it anyway. But there are quite a bit of people that just, you know, take what they're given and they move with it, they go with it. But anybody that just takes an hour and a half now, Tim, and just kind of goes through it. I mean, this is crazy stuff.
But, you know, Joe, those people that deny it, I always know right off the bat that when they deny it, I say, well, you've never looked, have you? And that's easy to figure out because anybody with a half a brain that looks and sees this stuff is going to go, holy shit, man, there's some bad stuff going on here. And so anybody that dismisses it out of hand, you know right off the bat, you haven't looked. You accepted the government story. You accepted that BS that they gave you from Popular Mechanics.
Popular Mechanics. What a great publication. You know, I used to be a big fan of Popular Mechanics until that hit piece came out. And wouldn't you know it, Tim, here's some coincidence for you. It's coincidence that the editor of Popular Mechanics just so happens to be related to Michael Chertoff.
Yeah, strange, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a coincidence.
Just another one of those many coincidences.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. But, you know, we were talking about people that were complicit in this act that either failed to act or said some pretty fishy things. And let me bring up Dick Cheney for a second. Dick Cheney was in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Ooh, the bunker. Beneath the White House in the morning of 9/11. Cheney was rushed there by Secret Service agents after the second plane hit. Dana Hyde tried to say differently, but DOT Secretary Norman Mineta testified that Cheney was there. And interestingly enough, so was his wife. Isn't that interesting? The 9/11 Commission never questioned the dichotomy in witness testimony. Be gone now, Norman Mineta. There's nothing to see here. Cheney tracked the Pentagon attack plane from well over 50 miles out before it had struck. Some say even 80 miles out. Even with 1960s military technology or missile technology, we could have blown that plane out of the air easily. Or a missile. But Cheney didn't. When pressed by a young man as to whether the order still stands, Cheney became visibly angry and whipped his neck around, declaring, "Of course the order still stands, you idiot." I'm paraphrasing. "Have you heard anything to the contrary? Oh, my heart. Oh, Jesus." It wasn't too long after that the Pentagon was hit. 184 people died at the Pentagon, and it's too bad Cheney wasn't one of them. I mean, why did Cheney order an evacuation when he was tracking the attack object over 50 miles out? He could have saved all those lives. Why wasn't the plane shut down? And why, Tim, why was there no evacuation?
Yeah, that's the big thing. That's a good question you ask. So he's watching it from 50 to 80 miles out. And number one, he doesn't shoot the plane down. But number two, he doesn't evacuate the Pentagon. I mean, look at all the people that died there that could have had a chance to live. And he did nothing. So another good point, Joe, about somebody who was negligent or derelict in their duties. And you've got to take all of this into consideration, folks. You got the President of the United States that sat on his ass. You got Donald Rumsfeld that abandoned his post. And you got Dick Cheney who didn't shoot the plane down and he didn't evacuate the Pentagon. But, besides that, Joe, you've also got America's mayor, Mr. 9/11, Rudy Giuliani, because remember, he told ABC's Peter Jennings live on the air that he was told by the Office of Emergency Management that the World Trade Center was going to collapse.
And let's not forget, Tim, let me just interrupt you for a second. Let's not forget, this is the same Rudy Giuliani that told our own Bob Tuskin to go get a shower and shave and a haircut.
Well, Bob doesn't need that, but...
But I digress. Go ahead.
Well, so Rudy admits this on national TV, and again, I got to take you folks back to the Windsor Tower, the Chinese, the television building, and all of those other buildings we mentioned that were on fire burned far longer, far hotter than the World Trade Center. I mean, it's not even close, and none of them collapsed. So how is it that on 9/11, someone in their infinite wisdom could have possibly said that these towers were going to collapse? Because that's what Rudy admits. He says the Office of Emergency Management told him those towers were going to come down. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is somebody approached Rudy later on, a few years afterwards, and they asked him, they said, "Sir, how do you sleep at night, knowing that you never knowing that, what you did about, the towers are going to collapse and stuff." And he absolutely denied that he ever said that. And that's just unbelievable. I mean, does he forget the fact that there's video out there on YouTube of him talking, to Peter Jennings live on ABC on air, and he actually made this statement? Now, I would think that he'd say, "Oh, I was taken out of context," or maybe, I didn't speak correctly, and what I meant to say was, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he does the absolutely insane, and he says, "I never said that. I never said that." It's like, for crying out loud, what kind of psychopath do you have to be? The record is right there, on ABC News. He said it live. And, folks, you can find it on YouTube. You'll be able to see it quite clearly. But, it doesn't just stop there. Rudy did a lot of really weird things about 9/11. And one of the things is he forbade any pictures of or video being taken of Ground Zero. I thought that was extremely strange.
Very weird.
Yeah, he made it illegal, folks, for the public to photograph Ground Zero, during 9/11. You know what that was all about? Is because they were starting to pull up iron that had the diagonal cuts across it, like you would do with, a cutting charge to get a building to walk itself into a free fall. They were starting to show different things like that in the rubble. And I thought, as soon as they started to see that, they thought, oh, we can't have that. You folks can't take pictures. So they actually made it illegal to take pictures of ground zero. And not only that, the Fresh Kills landfill, they made it illegal to take pictures of the dump. I mean, they'd taken this stuff to the dump to get rid of it, and then they say you can't take pictures because it's crime scene evidence. Well, if it's crime scene evidence, why the hell did you take it to the dump?
Why is it at the dump? I know, of all things. Of all things.
And the other thing that's funny, I wish we had John back on, because here's the thing about all that steel that they collected and they took out of there. They shipped it all off as far the hell away as they could get it. I mean, if they could have put that stuff on the moon, they would have done it. They shipped it to China, so that China could melt it down. Now, think about that. Why do you send that all the way overseas to get rid of it when the number one, steel facility is right next door in Pennsylvania? You could have sent all that steel to Pittsburgh, and they could have melted it down right there. Has anybody ever thought about that? All of that steel could have gone right to Pittsburgh, and our friend John King could have melted it down merrily, and they could have made things there. But instead, they decided, no, rather than send it next door, we're going to send this stuff all the way to China, because we want to get it the hell away from us as far so no one can look at that stuff.
And well, another person, don't forget, folks, Osama bin Laden was told, he was sold to us as the mastermind behind this whole operation. He was the guy. He was the man. He was the villain. And, there was these Osama videos that came out, fake ones at that are just absolute proof that the government lied to us. The FBI wanted poster shows that Osama was left-handed. Yet our government and our media sold us a video of a right-handed Osama that claimed to take responsibility for 9/11. He ate, drank, and gestured and wrote with his right hand in the video. Now, does this mean that everyone in the CIA and our media is too stupid to figure out that this is an obvious fake? I mean, you don't need special instruments to be able to see that the man was using his right hand when everybody knows he was left-handed. This is a very, very, very poor attempt to fool the American people. Now, do most Americans pay attention to stupid stuff like that? No. And that's what they say. Well, that's stupid. But to people that are paying attention, they know, holy crap, man, look at this. Look at this stuff. And it's solid proof, Tim.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Joe. And folks, you just need to digest that and think about it. That means that the government went out of their way to deceive you. Our media went out of their way to deceive you with clearly a fake Osama, a guy that was not the real deal. And they tried to tell you, they tried to tell all of us that this was the guy. This is the guy that pulled off 9/11.
That's right. When we come back, folks, it'll be the last segment of the show. It's a damn shame because there's so much to talk about with 9/11. So sit tight, stay tuned. We'll be right back after these messages. Don't go away. To send an email, the email address is thefreedomlink@centurylink.net. That's thefreedomlink@centurylink.net. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out and listening tonight. This is very important information, as it is the catalyst to what has ushered in the police state in the United States of America. And really throughout the world for that, in the Western world, I should say. It really has. We were talking about some interesting facts that make you go, out of these alleged terrorists, at least 5 of the hijackers were found to still be alive and living in the Middle East after 9/11. Some say as many as 9, Tim. All of these people denied any involvement.
Yeah.
It's interesting because even Muhammad Atta was said to have called his dad the day after.
Yeah.
I mean, how crazy is that?
Yeah, and his dad said he was scared, extremely, and said he never heard from him ever again after that.
Amazing. Absolutely.
So, yeah, one of those terrorists just happened to be the one. Remember that passport that they found that magically made it through the fireball, the paper passport, and landed on the street down below. Was able to land, on top of the rubble where they could find it. And so we've got a passport. We got the terrorists here. Well, once they found out that was one of the guys that's still alive, well, that story kind of went away right away. Oh, whoops. We can't mention that story now anymore. So that paper passport, story, that just evaporated. Kind of like the plane supposedly did. But,
right.
There are other things to this, Joe. And you look at the 9/11 Commission, which took it took Bush like 441 days that he drug his feet, You've got the greatest national disaster that's ever happened on American soil, and this guy drags his feet for over a year on having an investigation. But when they do get one, who's the first guy he says, I'm going to put in charge? Henry Kissinger. Oh, yeah, well, Henry had connections with bin Laden. But yet, they got the commission going, and they put Lee Hamilton and Thomas Keane in there. But these guys, they also had issues. Aside from having relations, Thomas Keane had relations with I'm trying to think. One of the fellas he had business dealings with was the brother-in-law of I want to say Osama. I guess his sister was married to Osama, I believe it was. But aside from all of that, you've got 6 members of the 9/11 Commission were all on the CFR, were on the Council on Foreign Relations, which I talked about last week. You had Philip Zelikow, you had Lee Hamilton, you had Thomas Keane, Jamie Gorelick, Bob Kerry, and John Lehman. These guys are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Again, just a weird coincidence, huh?
Yeah, a weird coincidence. Yeah, there's no coincidence there, Tim. It's absolutely not coincidental that these people are there. It's akin to ring knockers. Really, that's what I call it. When you're in the Navy, and as an officer, a lot of these people go to the Naval Academy. Well, when you get out of the Navy Academy, you get a ring. And then should you decide to make a career of it, fine. But at one point in time in your life, you're going to get out of the Navy and try to enter the workforce. And when you do, that ring alone will open so many different doors for you that aren't normally there for the average person. And the same thing goes for this CFR. It's a small little cabal. It's a small little, like Skull and Bones. You have Skull and Bones in your resume. Ooh, that opens the door. You're one of us. Come on in, And it's the same thing, whether it be CFR or it'll be Bilderberg. It doesn't matter what it is. They're all colluding and conspiring together.
Yeah, absolutely. They, and again, 441 days. That's just unbelievable. But now, Thomas Keane, I guess I was trying to make the connection with Keane. Not only did Kissinger have, connections with the bin Laden family, but Thomas Keane, he was the co-chair of the commission in Kissinger's place, and he sat on the board of directors of a company that had business dealings with financier Khalid bin Mahfouz. Now, Keane was a director of the Emerita Hess Corporation, and they did business with a company that was owned in part by Mahfouz. And the real kicker to all of this is Mahfouz's sister just happened to be married to Osama bin Laden. So, again, you've got a huge conflict of interest with the people that they put on that, supposed 9/11 commission, or as I like to call it, the 9/11 omission. But, besides all of that, and we couldn't even scratch on this, if we had 4 hours, Joe. But you look at the Bush family connection. You ever taken a look at all the different connections from the Bush family in 9/11?
Oh, Lord. That too much.
Yeah, Marvin Bush. He actually sat on the board of directors for Securicom, and that's the company that was responsible for the electronic security for the World Trade Center. And Bush's cousin, Wirt D. Walker III, was the CEO for the company. And strangely enough, all the security cameras went out that day on 9/11. And then also the other thing that's very weird is that that company, Securcom, their contract ran out on 9/11. And now, as if that isn't hard enough to believe, Marvin Bush, he left Securcom just before 9/11. And then, you know where he went to? He went to HCC, the Houston Casualty Company, which was one of the insurance carriers for the World Trade Center. So this guy's involved in so many different things that have to do with the World Trade Center. He went from the people that are, supposedly responsible for the electronic security to one of the companies that's paying out for the disaster. And then you've got Jeb Bush, who they said had declared martial law in Florida the day before 9/11. You got Daddy Poppy Bush, George H.W. Bush, who coincidentally spent the night at the White House the night before 9/11, and his son was in Florida. He was already down there for the elementary school visit. So son's away, but Dad comes in to spend the night at the White House the night before 9/11. God only knows what him and Darth Cheney talked about that night. And then, of course, you got W, who sat on his butt during the whole thing. So a lot of things about the Bush family that just are very unsettling about 9/11.
Plus, not only about 9/11, but they have a storied history of effing stuff up throughout American history. I mean, whether you talk about Prescott and his shiesty shenanigans, being a lover of all that is Nazi, and then covering his tracks by starting the USO. Who's going to prosecute the guy that founded the USO? Come on. He's good to Prescott. He's a hell of a guy. And then,
CIA, too.
Yeah, of course. And, then you got Daddy Bush. Daddy Bush definitely screwed some things up. Good old George H.W.
Yeah.
Not to mention W. I think W was just I think they're so inbred that by the time they got to W, I mean, he's dumb as a bag of rocks. And so they just put him in there to be a figurehead, but that's it. I mean, look at the people that surrounded him. I mean, they surrounded him with watchdogs.
Yeah.
Make sure that boy don't screw up again.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's how they do it, dude. That's how they do it. That's how they do it with Obama now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's it. Any final thoughts, Timmy, as we wind the show up?
Well, again, 2 hours isn't nearly enough, and we'll I'm sure be talking about 9/11 again, folks, because again, it is the catalyst for everything that has happened in this country since September 11th, 2001. Everything that's happened in this country is because of 9/11. So you can't talk about this enough. And go to work tomorrow and talk with your friends, talk with your neighbors, talk with your family members. People need to know that this country has been shanghaied. A coup has been perpetrated on this country. A couple more quick facts before we go. The 9/11 emergency dispatch tapes, the talk forth back with the ambulance drivers, the FDNY, the firefighters and stuff like that, those radio dispatch tapes were all classified after 9/11. And you think, what for? I mean, they did this in Washington, D.C., and they did it in New York. Now, somebody was able to get the ones in New York through a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. And when you listen to the tapes, it becomes clear why they made them classified. Because in the tapes, you hear the firefighters going from floor 1 all the way up to the impact floor on floor 78, and there's no fire. Matter of fact, they absolutely say, where's the fire? Let me know when you see some fire. And the only fire they found was 2 small isolated pockets of fire on floor 78 that could have easily been put out with 1 or 2 hoses. So that's why they classified those tapes, because that goes against their official story that, hey, there was heat, a lot of heat and fire that undermined, the structural integrity of the building, and that's why it fell. There was no fire. There was nothing. And that's what they tell on these tapes. And yet they tried to classify them. They tried to hide these from you. They tried to hide them from us. And beyond that, you've got the in-flight phone calls, which many people say is absolutely impossible to do with the cell phones. You got the one guy who calls his mom and addresses himself by his full name. Hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham. And then you got Solicitor General Ted Olson, who was said to have been talking with his wife. He said he had numerous calls from his wife, Barbara, as the flight was coming in. I think that was the one to hit the Pentagon. And the FBI says those calls never happened. They've investigated it. So they've actually said, Ted Olson, you're lying. Those calls never happened. You had the FAA manager who collected all the recorded interviews with the flight controllers, and then he destroyed all of the tapes that day. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
No, you're right, Tim. I mean, that was 2 hours is not enough to talk 9/11, folks, but the show is over. Stay tuned next for Ken and the Information Nation. Thank you for coming out tonight, folks. Next show, Tuesday, 10 p.m. Eastern. See you there.